Before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to offer congratulations to my Vice Chair, Mike Rust, who is a newly married man, just back from his honeymoon. So, congratulations. Little redness there. That's okay. You're welcome.
Technicolor.
Technicolor. That's good. That's what it's supposed to do for you. Marriage. Embarrass you, right? So the first thing on the agenda is just an agenda review. So really quick, at our last meeting, we heard that the city manager would be coming back to us with his proposed strategies for filling the FY15 general fund gap. And so tonight, John's going to go through a brief presentation of his strategy and give us his thoughts, after which we will have a chance to ask some questions and kind of go into some initial discussion. And I'll also talk through what our next steps and the rest of this process will look like so that we all understand what's happening over the coming months. So that's our plan for this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of thoughts up front as we get started. I think with all the work that's gone on over the last 8 months, it's been very informative. From a staff perspective, we've learned quite a bit from the committee, the discussions, the public, and just a variety of inputs that we've received. And so we view this really not as a takeoff, but really as we're coming in for a landing. And what you'll see from our budget proposal is really, we think it reflects the conversations that have occurred over the past 8 months. And so we hope you'll see it the same way. And just briefly, it has been a different process. We started back in July, actually back in May or June, when eventually the Budget Committee and then the City Council actually adopted the budget. And one of the things that, what you said was, we want to try to do some things differently as we move towards this year's budget. We were dealing with a $5.3 million gap at the time. We said we wanted to go ahead and fill that gap out of the reserves, and then subsequent to that, immediately begin a different kind of a process, which we've done. A number of meetings, been community workshops. You put together a finance investigative team that spent quite a bit of time looking at a whole lot. Developed some options that then went out for public hearings at the beginning of this year. A revenue team was put together, and all of that to get us to this point here where we'll present a strategy for the FY15 general fund budget. And I just want to emphasize what we're talking about here is the general fund budget, which is where we spend most of our time and our energy as a budget committee, and really appropriately so, because these are the discretionary dollars that fund general government kinds of things. And so that's really what we're talking about. Our approach has not changed from our perspective for the last 5 years. What we continue to do internally into the organization, and as we present our budgets, we want to present balance. And for us, that's been balancing fiscal responsibility, fiscal stability, maintaining our fiscal strength with community services, minimizing the impact on those services that the community relies on, many of which more so through the recession. And so we've said that's a continuing importance for us. And then we also want to balance that with employee satisfaction. And how we've talked about that a lot is we have been very aggressive in managing impacts to the employees the last 5 years. So as we've reduced positions, we have, with few exceptions, people have not left the organization involuntarily. And we manage that pretty hard to try to minimize those impacts as well. And we've also said we want to invest into the community. We don't want to just try to survive our way through the recession, but we want to continue to invest, and we have. There have been more street maintenance projects that have gone on over the last several years than in the history of Eugene, thanks to the voters of this community. There's more downtown investment than has happened in the last 25 years. Our fire departments between Springfield and Eugene are essentially merged fire departments in providing exceptional service at a very affordable cost. We've done some things around investments in animal services. We're continuing to look at and invest in the redevelopment of the riverfront through the eWeb project. So there is a lot of investment that's going on in the community, and so we haven't said we're going to turn inward, we want to continue to turn outward. So our approach hasn't changed for the last 5 years, and that's what we're continuing to move forward with. We talk about stable versus sustainable budget, and just to remind us what that means, we really have been working on a stable budget for the last 5 years and as we move into FY15. And for us that means that we live within our means, that our revenues exceed our expenditures. And that's what we mean by living within our means. We want to maintain a responsible reserve. We've talked about reserves quite a bit over the last year and years. And we talk about a benchmark of 8% in our reserve for revenue shortfall. And you'll see as we go forward, we aren't going to meet that target. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And you'll know the mantra for me is use ongoing revenue for ongoing expenditures. Don't use ongoing or one-time revenues for ongoing expenditures. That's part of a stable budget. But we're also wanting eventually to start working towards a sustainable budget. There are many unmet needs that we have around facilities maintenance, parks and recreation facilities and operations, human services. We've talked about the ambulance transport fund, jails beds. We need to implement Envision Eugene and a variety of things. So we still need to work towards a sustainable budget, but stability has to be the first place in that. This is becoming one of my new favorite graphs, along with another one I'll show you in a minute, because it tells, I think, a really compelling story when we match this with the expenditure side in just a moment. What this says is prior to the recession, our general fund revenues were increasing on an average of 3.5% per year. Through the recession, they were averaging 0.7% increase through each year. And then as we're moving forward through FY15 and beyond, we are forecasting that it will be at about 2.9% per year going forward. So what I think this says is, and when we match this with the expenditure, this in and of itself, what it says to us is, one, it does offer some hope and encouragement that we've kind of worked our way through this really difficult 4 or 5 year period, and what we've done is we've said perhaps we're starting to see the other side of that. We're not going to go back to where we were pre-recession. At some point we may think of those as the golden years of local government financing, but we are starting to see a little uptick out of that. The other piece that's important on this is that average gain going forward we put into the forecast, so we are projecting that our general fund revenues are increasing going forward from here. This on the budget side says that pre-recession our average annual growth in our general fund was 6.2%. Through the recession we drove down our costs and our expenditures through a whole lot of things and actually got it down to 0.9% per year. And then projection going forward is at 2.6% per year. And there's a couple things that I think out of these two graphs tell a pretty interesting story. One is on the revenue side, going forward, it's projected at 2.9% per year. The expenditure side is at 2.6%. What that means is we're living within our means going forward. That's good news. The other part of this, I think, is a pretty interesting conversation, is that prior to the recession, we were going forward at 3.5% per year on our revenue side, post-recession at 6.2%. What that says is even going into the recession, we were structurally imbalanced. And that was even before we hit this significant downturn. And what we've done over the last 5 years, what we've collectively have done, is we have structurally changed our financial system. And we have structurally changed our budget from going in unstructurally unstable, weathered through the recession, and on the far end of that, we're living within our means. And so that fundamentally changed our budget. And that's a good story. And collectively, we've done that while continuing to invest into the community. We've reduced our organizational footprint, which is, when we started on this journey, we said the way to weather and to thrive at the end of this is we have to shrink our footprint. And so in the FY15 proposed budget, we will be at FTE per capita under 9. It'll be about 8.9 per thousand. And this continues the trend of the lowest FTE per capita in the last 25 or 30 years. And so we have been shrinking the organizational footprint, which we think is also in a responsible way. This is a recap of where we've been, and you've seen this before, and you're familiar with this. Coming into the recession, there was $1 million gap, which of course we all wish that's where we had been all the way through, and there was a lot of energy around that first $1 million. But we quickly moved into a $12 million gap. We got to the 5.7. You can see that coming all the way through. This year, the gap is 2.5, not 3. I've sent out some information on that recently, so that's good news for us. But by the time we will have gotten through all of this to include the current gap, it will be close to a $30 million gap we have closed in this period of time. And if you look back at the other slides, not only have we closed a $30 million gap, but we've structurally changed our budget. And so that's where we've been over the last several years. And we've done this through a whole lot of ways that you know, with savings, through efficiencies and innovation, and a variety of ways of doing that. So as we move into FY15, I think it's important to note, and what this graph says is essentially, if we don't do anything to close the gap, and again, this gets back at the one-time ongoing expenditure conversation, if we don't do anything, we will be expending into our reserves pretty significantly, way out of balance, not living within our means, and ultimately what that means is our savings account is the dotted line, and you can see the zero line right there. Our savings account actually goes below zero within 2 years by FY16, and of course we can't allow that happen. That just can't happen. And so it tails off pretty quickly. With the budget that we'll present to you, the different story is we close the gap. We're living within our means over that forecast period, and the reserve for revenue shortfall is the dotted line. While it trails down, it stays above zero, which is good. It doesn't stay at that 8% target figure. It actually goes down to closer to 1.5%. But we are living within our means, and we're still maintaining a reserve. The other piece that I think is important to note on this graph, people continually ask, why don't we spend our reserves as we try to weather through the recession? And I keep saying we do spend them. We're not saving them for some other rainy day. We're spending them as the rainy days occur. And that's part of what this graph will show us, is that we actually do draw down our reserves. And we have consciously talked about that. There are times when we've tried to beef it up a little bit because we know we're going to have some significant increases. The library levy was one, the PERS were another one that we had to absorb, and so then we could glide path. And so we have purposely been using our reserves to help us glide path as we go. The other reason why it's not prudent to just automatically keep an 8% target is the reality is you would over collect or over you would unnecessarily reduce your expenditures more than you need to in order to save that. And so that's partly why we budget out 4 or 5 years into the forecast. But what this shows is we can maintain a reserve. We have been using our reserves, but it stays above zero, and all that's positive. And we're living within our means over that forecast period. So here's the meat of the FY15 budget strategies, and I'll talk about a couple of these in a little bit more detail. The Human Services Commission discretionary funding, $250,000, and right now we, as you know, allocate and appropriate dollars that we send over to HSC every year, and then they go through their process and distribute those dollars, and we contribute to that, and they provide valuable services into the community. We also fund other social services, more directly fund those. This is not what this represents. So we've directly funded St. Vincent de Paul and their car camping program and things like that. This is the discretionary funding that we would include for the county. Library services, what that represents is closing the downtown library for a half a day and closing Sheldon branch. It keeps Bethel branch open, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and Renee and her team can talk in much more detail about the reasons for that. But briefly, when we took a look at both Bethel and Sheldon branch, from a social equity perspective, it's the demographics, it's the access to the downtown library, it's the potential partnership with the Y over in Bethel and all, which are the discriminating factors for us when we talk about those two particular branches. We've also said let's transfer a portion of our community events budget, which is in the general fund, over to the cultural services sub-fund. The cultural services sub-fund, while it rests in the general fund, it's actually a standalone self-supporting fund. And so what we're doing here is proposing transferring $50,000 to that fund, in which then they will have to support that through their services that they provide, whether it's through the Holt Center or I want to say Kesey, the amphitheater, and all the variety of activities that they have, and we believe that we'll be able to do that. Be a bit of a push, but we have a great team working on that. On recreation services, a little more than half of that, close to $150,000 of that actually represents fee increases. So we talked about whether it's program fees or pool fees or any combination of those. That's what that represents. The other $50,000 of that represents a part of the scholarship program that we currently provide. And what our proposal will be is that we don't fund that as an ongoing expense, and it represents maybe 50% of that program. But not to fund all of that, but at the same time, any dollars that remain in the recreation programming at the end of the year, we put into a pool that would then carry over for scholarships. And so we would continue to try to build that scholarship fund up and kind of having as a revolving fund. And so we would reduce the ongoing cost with that and then continually find ways through grants or through some end-of-year recreation dollars to keep filling that back up to minimize any impact on that. The transfer of the stormwater services to the stormwater fund, that's that conversation where we had that there are parks services right now that have a nexus to the stormwater fund. How we maintain our parks does matter with respect to stormwater quality, and there's a tight nexus to that. We can transfer that over to the stormwater fund and have that fund pay for those particular services right at the moment. Central services, travel, memberships, miscellaneous, that's kind of a bucket of a variety of things that are in the city manager's office and in central services. None of there's nothing in there that would eliminate anything. So we would not be eliminating sister cities. We would continue to fund LCOG. We would continue to do those kinds of things, but we would be shrinking some of those activities as we move forward, but not eliminating anything at all. Equity, human rights, neighborhoods, and sustainability. That represents two positions directly impacting into those programs. Right now we have 2 vacancies, and we've had those vacancies for about 8 months. One of them was Raquel Wells's position, which was a direct support to the Human Rights Commission and that program. The other one was Francisca's position, and that really was more of a combination of some neighborhoods, some equity and human rights, some access, supported the police department in a variety of our outreach efforts. And so those 2 positions would be eliminated in that program. There's a third position that, while it's funded in that, it's really more directly supportive of the CMO and the citywide as in general, and the vacant position in that one is our public service officer. So we will be relooking at how that gets provided to provide those same kinds of services. So those are currently all vacant positions, and 2 of those have been vacant for up to 8 months. So essentially, in this program, what you see and have seen in the last 6 or 8 months is what you would see next year. We would continually take a look at are there more efficient ways for distribution of newsletters and some of those kinds of things. So that's what that represents. Parks maintenance is $300,000. We had some conversation about that through the budget committee process, and that's any number of how they go about doing their maintenance. The philosophy that Kurt and his team has had throughout this budgeting period is we want to try to preserve assets and not allow the assets to deteriorate, but there is sort of a decreasing level of maintenance that comes along with that, and so that's kind of continually down that piece. So that's the proposal for the FY15 budget to get to the $2.5 million. There are path forwards options on a couple of these items, which I do want to bring up. People have talked to us about them, so I do think we want to see if there's any interest in these as we go forward. On the human services side, what an option could be, and I actually would recommend, is a policy change that says that first $250,000 of marginal beginning working capital actually is earmarked to fund this piece of that. So what that does practically, it helps on the structural budget side, because what we're doing is we're eliminating the ongoing expenditure of that. What we're saying is it has first priority for marginal beginning working capital. Right now, you might remember there's facilities maintenance that has that first priority, so this would replace that. While it's a little bit risky, the reality is the risk is pretty low that this particular piece would not get funded. And if, to be candid, if I were the county or the Human Services Commission, this wouldn't be my favorite proposal, because what happens is they would just can rely on $250,000 less for budgeting. If I were on the city perspective, one of the positives is it increases the flexibility for that money. So the council could choose actually to appropriate that to the HSC. It would be kind of mid-year, and then they can budget that. Or if you had some other priority for those dollars, whether it's emergency housing or transitional housing or whatever else, you have that now, the flexibility with that. And so some people would see this as a pro, some as a con. From a purely dollar amount, it's very, it would be unusual not to eventually have the whole dollars available. They would just come at different times and budget differently, but it actually structurally changes the budget. On the library services, I think an option that would be good to consider is using one-time funds actually to keep the Sheldon branch open. And you know my thinking about one-time monies. This might be one that we should explore as an option. seriously, and then ask the revenue team really to develop a scope and timing of a levy around a library. And it could do a couple of things. One, I think I've heard and the staff has heard, and I think everybody has heard over the last 8 months, that there's a lot of energy around the branch libraries, as there should be. And that there's seems to be an interest. What people would say is, we think the community would support a library levy. Part of it would be is what's the scope of that? Is it just for branch libraries? Do we buy back the library hours? There's been plans to redevelop the 4th floor of the library. There are some additional materials we might want to include in the library. Is it a November or is it a May ballot? I don't know, but that's something that maybe that revenue team can really grab onto and kind of think about and move forward. The question that might be in your mind is, well, why not use one-time money also for that half a day proposed reduction? From my perspective, my concern, using one time for the branch library makes me nervous. Increasing that really makes me nervous. And I think the branch libraries particularly provide a very focused effort for folks to really get behind going forward. So I think that both of these options we should think about providing options, path forward for a couple of items. Then lastly, this is, you've seen this, and where we have been and where we continue to focus is living within our means and maintaining reserves, continuing to invest into the community, and needing to think about how do we increase the tax base and jobs, and continually looking for efficiencies. And then the new revenue side is particularly around the library levy. That might be a good place to be thinking as we go forward. So with that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for that. So what I'd like to do now is, before we go into actual discussion, open the floor up for any questions that anyone has that we'd like to present to the city manager or staff about what's just been presented. So are there any questions?
Not comments, right?
Not comments. We're going to go into a discussion phase after that. Yeah. So this, okay. So
Good luck.
okay. So Councilor Surratt.
So, not having had a chance to look at your full piece here, I'm wondering if how you've handled funding for El Rapa in your proposed budget.
El Rapa was a one-time funding last year, so it's not included in the budget.
And can you give us a estimate of what the Sheldon branch library cost is? The
$350,000.
$350,000?
Yes.
Thanks. Those are my questions.
Okay. Councilor Taylor.
Pretty sure that
Check.
was right. Yeah, I'll check, but I think that was pretty close.
Are you eliminating neighborhood newsletters?
Excuse me?
Are you eliminating neighborhood newsletters?
What we would want to do is try to figure out an most efficient way to do that. We would move a lot more towards social media, for sure. Eventually, could it result in eliminating hard copies? Might, but I wouldn't say we're going to just do that automatically. But we would be looking to do some things differently in that whole piece.
And why would you, well, I don't know if I'm going to ask a why question or what. Why would you choose a Sunday to close the library?
I'd have to ask Renee or Connie to talk about that.
Coming up.
How they doing, Branch Library?
The question is Sunday. It's really, Sunday mornings are our slowest time in the downtown library. Sundays in general don't see a smaller number, but in the mornings we do. So that was the logic around that.
How much money would that save?
$300,000.
Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Ken?
I have, I guess, kind of a general question. When you were talking about general fund revenues and the gains before the recession and then the flatlining, if you will, I kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about your thinking about it. You're talking about it at the average gain increasing up to about 2.9% going forward. Could you? I think that's good. Could you talk about that? What you guys are thinking and why? And
yeah, and I'll start the conversation, and then depending on the detail, Twyla may be able to come up and pursue that a little bit more. Part of it is we do get information from the assessor's office, which is where it gets based upon, and so from a property tax perspective. And so as assessed values recover from the recession, that automatically adds a bit to that. I suspect we are seeing a little bit of the result of some development that has occurred in the community over the last couple years, and so there's a little bit of that that's built into that property tax piece. On the eWeb side, for example, when they have increases in their rates, we see an increase in the silt revenue that comes back from that. I don't know, Twyla, if you want to add some more detail in some of that.
So generally, that is correct. Those are the two main factors. The other, we have hundreds of sources in the general fund on the revenue side, and generally we're seeing them just with inflation kind of hold steady. But I actually think those are the two main factors that we're seeing, is that really primarily property taxes, that uptick there with information from the assessor and growth that we forecast over the period, and then also just a stable, steady eWeb silt forecast that includes their future anticipated rate increases.
okay, thanks.
I'll put myself in the queue next, and my question was, if I'm remembering correctly, a few months ago, the county talked about feeling that they were much more stable and balanced than they had expected to be and have been in previous years. And so my question is, have they communicated any willingness or desire to return some of their contributions to human services funding to previous levels? And how would that impact our thinking there?
No, I haven't had any conversations with them about that, so I don't know what they're thinking about.
Okay, great, thank you. So Mark, you're next.
And my question is in regard to slide number 11 that you had up. It's the bar graph that talks about the fiscal year budget strategies. And so you talked a bit about, yeah, correct. So you talked about a fair amount about living within our means. And so I look at this, and to me, 3 out of these 6 years are still slightly over the 100%. So can you talk about, is that due to anticipated expenditures that for those 3 years kick us over the 100%?
Yeah, so the way this gets forecasted out, we forecast over a 6-year period. And so part of what we're trying to do is balance hitting at the end of the 6 years something in a reserve category, each of the individual years trying the best we can to sort of live within our means, but really thinking about it over the 6 years. And then in some of these areas, for example, I think FY16, we're probably anticipating our next PERS bump. Same with FY18. And so what happens is you get a little extra expenditure than what you are sort of on a straight line, though we don't budget on a straight line, but as if you were on a straight line. And so that counts for a little bit of that. One way now we try to anticipate that is we'll build up a little bit on the reserves just to be able to help smooth that curve out as we go. So 16 and 18 are primarily anticipated PERS bumps.
So as a follow-up, so for fiscal year 20, you've targeted that to be below 100, and this is kind of how those
Yeah.
line works out between now and then?
Yeah, so what we say is by the time we get there, how do we do that? And then balancing against what is the gap that we're trying to fill. So, obviously, if we try to fill $5 million gap, a couple of these charts would look great. The reality is the impact out into the community and inside the organization is pretty significant. So that's why going all the way back to that first graph of trying to balance the finances with the employees, with the services, is sort of a constant equation for us.
Great. Counselor Brown.
Thanks. I'm sorry for coming in late. You may have discussed this. I missed the library piece when you were going down budget strategy. And then further down the page, there was, the recommendation, use one-time funds to keep Sheldon open, but not that. I'm just wondering what the...
Our proposal already keeps Bethel open.
Oh, it does?
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, great. Mayor Piercy.
I just want to follow up on Claire's question, and that is about RAPA. And so we've been using in-kind resources to support RAPA, right? And so you're saying we're not going to be doing
Right.
that?
We've been using a combination of both in-kind and cash. And so what the Budget Committee did last time and the Council approved was one-time money for that, so that's not rebudgeted this year. But we could sure have a conversation about LRAP, and we anticipated that the Budget Committee would want to talk about that sometime in the next couple of weeks.
Yes.
Great. Counselor Clark.
Thank you. I appreciate the information in the proposal, sir. Very well done. One of the pieces that's interesting to me is I've served on the council now for about 8 years. Over the course of that, we have a very controversial community conversation around one of our policies, and that is from the perspective of council to invest in our future tax base by discounting the things we get short term in order to get a larger return in the long term. You mentioned that all the 6-year out property tax revenue forecasts are coming from the assessor's office. Is that correct?
I don't...
Yes. Oh, sorry.
So the forecast, we received forecast information this last October, which we base our 14, we get our 14 numbers, and then we project some growth rates based on the information we get from them. So the future forecast is based on that information and those discussions with the assessor's office, but the forecast is actually just a forecast based on this current year.
But everything is based on the application of projected rates.
Correct.
Based on circumstance, based on market condition, that sort of thing?
In this year, yes.
Do you go in and calculate the very large projects that receive MUPTs that will fall off of the discount period over the course of that period and then suddenly be subject to the full tax period on an individual basis? Because as we look at, for example, the student housing that's happened over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, there are a number of MUPTs in there that are going to fall off and begin to be taxed at full value. So are we going in and calculating those, or are we likely to see an unanticipated increase based on projections?
Twyla, can I help you with that?
Yes.
So, Sue Custer-George, our finance director, and I talk about that quite a bit in terms of how you look to the future to account for that. And part of it is that there's so many different variables in what happens with property tax revenue increases, and so some things go down and some things go up. And because, yes, they're big projects, and yes, they will help, the growth in the property tax base, but they're not significant enough to track individually over time, and so we don't spend as much time focusing in that area, and we look at the bigger picture.
When you say that, I apologize for the interruption. When you say they're not significant enough, it seems from the community conversation as though they're fairly significant.
And I apologize.
No,
I don't really mean it to. It's not insignificant, but in the scope of $80 million in revenue, those dollars, when we talk about something like a Valley River Center or something like that, it's the scalability of those and the variabilities within the property tax revenue they account for a lot of different things, and so some of that growth factor catches some of it because there's just some variability within property taxes in general.
And the other thing is, the couple of big projects that we think about, Capstone and the Hub, don't fall within in the projection period. And so if you were to take a look at what have normally been MUPTI projects, what will be captured is important for the individual project, but it's a pretty low scale for overall. So even if you were to capture $40,000 or $50,000, which is real money, if you just budgeted against that projected $50,000, what you're not doing is accounting for all the other 10,000 variables that's going to adjust the property tax. And so which is the way that we forecast it out, while you're not looking at every individual one, the average tends to work out pretty well.
Okay. I'm happy that you were able to find a way to keep the Bethel Branch Library whole there, and I look forward to finding a way to do the Sheldon Library branch as well.
We're near the option right there.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, any other questions before we go into some comments and discussion? Councilor Taylor.
Yes. When you calculate the cost of the branch libraries, do you include the cost of transporting books from the downtown library to the branch libraries when books are ordered?
Sit in the front, Renee.
So the question is, do we have a cost to transport books? We do. We have a courier service. It's city courier that...
You include that in the cost of running the library?
Yes. Yeah. Sure.
So it would cost more for Bethel than for Sheldon, right?
No, it doesn't. That is a small piece of the overall cost of providing the service.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Marty.
Actually, one, I'm grateful that even the discussion about closing Sheldon Branch has involved keeping some of those services available at the nearby Sheldon Community Center. Is there a willingness to look at that, expanding that? I mean, given the support for library services in general, but the cost of maintaining large branch libraries, is there a possibility of having mini libraries that wouldn't really have a robust research capacity, but would have more popular books and children's programs at the community centers?
We have talked about that, and we've actually had some preliminary conversations with 4J around co-locating branch libraries at the high schools. Now, there's examples of where those have worked really well to have public libraries and school libraries sharing space. But again, it is a cost, and so we're not looking to expand services elsewhere at this time. If we are able to stabilize some more funding, that would be something we'll continue to explore.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I don't see any additional questions, so we'll move into discussion. I'm sorry, did you have a question? Discussion, okay, you want to be first for discussion. Okay, you're right out of the gate. So I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. So there's a lot of things in here that reflect the 8 months worth of conversation and work that we've done up to date. And so I look forward to us having conversation and really being able to focus on some of the things here that we've not had as much chance to talk about in depth and look at some of these things like these proposals around the Sheldon Library and how we might go forward around this human services and that kind of thing, especially looking towards how do we build not only the stable budget that we know we need for FY15, but what are the pieces that we need to build going forward for the sustainable budget for the long run that the city managers talked about. So with that, I'd like to open it up for discussion. We're going to start with two minutes, and if we feel like people are feeling loquacious, that's a vocabulary word for the day, then we will move up to 3 minutes, depending on kind of how the will of the body. So I think, Councilor Poling, you were first.
We need a second round, so. Okay, first of all, I'm a little disappointed in closing the Sheldon Branch Library. Unfortunately, it's put me in a rock and a hard spot because I'm a staunch advocate for both branch libraries,
And I'm also, for a long time, for many years, been a staunch advocate about using reserves for ongoing services. So no matter which way I go with this, I'm going to look like a bad guy to some people, and I don't like that position. In looking at page 6 of the booklet that we got, when we're talking about the Sheldon Branch Libraries, about possible things that can happen, I know it's just a projection at this time, but there are too many what-ifs involved in that. And I just, I'm not happy with it. It doesn't make me feel good at all. Unfortunately, I grabbed the wrong stack of papers out of my jungle in my office, and I don't have the list where I wrote down all of my numbers from my proposal. But if it only, closing the main library saves for half a day saves $300,000, and it's $350,000 to keep the Sheldon Branch Library open. My suggestion is going to be that we close the main library for a full day, and then come up with that $50,000 from somewhere else. And I'll go through the list of stuff that we had proposed for budget cuts to see if I can find a mere $50,000. Because I think it's important for the people in the area that's serviced by the Sheldon Branch Library to be able to go there. And it's, to me, I'm very glad that the Bethel Library is staying open, but to me, it's just as difficult for a mom with 3 small kids or somebody with a disability to get on a bus and ride down from the Sheldon area to the main library as it is from the Bethel-Danabo area to the main library. So I am going to do everything I can to try and find some way to keep that Sheldon Branch Library open without using the one-time monies for ongoing services. I think that's the only thing we can do.
Councillor Pulling, would you like to be in the second round?
Yes, please.
Okay. Councillor Clark.
I'm going to pass.
Councillor Taylor.
Oh, I'd like to point out that South Eugene doesn't have a branch library, and it's just as hard for people out there to get downtown as it is for people from the other parts of town. And I think it's really awful to close the main library, especially for a full day. I thought we had pretty much agreed on that.
Councillor Surratt.
Thank you. So I'm not necessarily ready to vote yay on this, but I really do appreciate the work of your team and the willingness to make recommendations that aren't necessarily your favorite way to approach the budget strategy, but in large regard helps us stay the course in terms of maintaining services. It makes me feel definitely that you and your team really listened and paid attention to what we were hearing from the community as we had that larger list of potential cuts. And obviously it's not necessarily completely satisfactory in terms of there still may be some concern around the services piece that needs to be addressed, and strategies around library services. But I think it's a much more workable set of options than we were facing before, and I definitely appreciate that. So as the mayor mentioned, I will be looking to see how we can restore LRAPA funding. I think that's an important commitment on our part. And an agency that is very important to the health of our community. So I'll be looking into that. But I'm definitely willing to talk further about strategies around the libraries. I agree that making an effort to keep the branch libraries open is important. I feel like the stories we heard from community about how they value and use and access those branch libraries were very enlightening. And really important to try to maintain those services. And while I don't like to pit one service against another, for me the idea of closing the branch library for half a day or even a full day in order to maintain those branch libraries, it is a trade-off I'd be willing to consider.
Great, thank you. Councillor Pryor.
Oh, thank you. First off, I am incredibly appreciative of the amount of effort and creativity that's gone into this proposal. I mean, we were looking at having to make some cuts we didn't want to have to make, and I think what the city manager has done is tried to work to figure out how to make cuts that we still have to make, but do it in a way that would try to maintain as much as we said we like to keep. I mean, for me, The fact that $250,000 of human service money is not certain is a challenge for me. But the fact that it's been placed first in line to be funded when the money comes available is something that almost sweetens that to the point where I can live with it. And I think that's really the key element here is, as we were talking about at our meeting earlier today, there's things that nobody's going to like in this proposal because it involves cuts. And there's no way to have a budget that involves cuts that somebody isn't going to want to, be upset about or not like. So this is trying to figure out a way to navigate through there. And the proposal with some tweaking, I think, is kind of what we have to face as being where we're going to go. With regard to the library, using one-time money to keep the Sheldon branch open for that year as we look for the revenue option does have a certain level of uncertainty built into it, and I appreciate that. And I would be willing to consider, and I don't know what the cost implications are. Renee would have to put a pencil to a piece of paper and figure it out. But right now, the library's available 7 days a week. One of those 7 days would be closed for a half a day. Rather than closing it for an entire day, what if you closed it half a day Saturday and half a day Sunday? So you still had 7 days worth of library, but on 2 of those days, it opens at noon or something like that. Then you could have the secure money that you could perhaps then use for the branch libraries. Because I, like others here, absolutely believe the branch libraries are important. They are a fundamental connection with our neighborhood.
Great, thank you. So I put myself in the queue next, and then Marty, I got you after me. So I also want to say thank you for both the creative thinking and also the, I think, responsiveness to what this committee talked about, what we heard about from the community, and thinking about some creative ways to get us to something that's much closer to workable. So I actually feel like this is, I'm very comfortable with the idea of using the one-time dollars for Sheldon Library and then working towards what is an appropriate library levy. I heard from the community, we really care about these libraries. We really value the role that they play in the community. And I believe that there is support, and we can come up with a scope of a library levy that supports that as an ongoing service that we provide. And so I personally think that that's great. I was also really interested in the slide that looked back to 2003 to 2009. I was not involved at all with the process then and not really familiar with what was going on. And clearly that was a time where, for whatever reason, the city was spending much more than we took in. And so we as a community got really quite used to having more than we were willing to pay for. And therefore, this is a period where we are, as a community, going through retrenchment and learning new behaviors and learning new expectations. And I believe that one of those expectations is, if these are things we really value, let's figure out collectively how we're going to pay for them. So I personally am very comfortable. I like the idea of using some limited amount of one-time money to keep it open so that we don't have to go through this, close the library and then reopen it, but can actually continue to serve that community while we look at how we do the library levy. So I appreciate the creative thinking there. Just as a question, what is that LREPA amount again? Do we recall what that was?
It was $30,000 in one-time funding, $30,000 in funding,
okay,
and $25,000 in kind.
Okay.
Attorney services.
And so for us to continue to support LRAPA would be at those two numbers combined, 55?
That's what we did.
Okay. Okay. Just as a curiosity. Okay. Thank you very much. So, Marty, I believe you're next.
First of all, I appreciate the city staff's willingness to explore restructuring some services to make them more efficient. It's really great. It's really hard to do under the gun, and so I doubly appreciate it. From the Revenue Committee's point of view, we're not asking you to commit now to a particular solution. It would be useful to know the range of options you want. What I've been pushing for is a set of 3. One would be new revenue on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars, but not millions, that would be permanent, sort of a small package, hopefully well balanced between different interest groups, but something that would give some ongoing revenue. A medium-term solution that would resolve the whole issue. A library levy would be one possibility, or something similar. What I also recommended is, if it is a property tax-based one, that we also forward a recommendation, either pro or con, or just to consider the permanency of such a property tax revenue. Which means if we do a library levy, I think you need to seriously consider whether you want to keep doing a library levy every 5 years, or whether you should spin it off into a library district, which would have its own secure permanent base and not result in a new campaign every 5 years. So that's kind of my perspective on it. There are other voices in the room there that say, no, we should just give one solution and let them figure it out. We're not elected, so I've preferred to let this group handle that. So if you have feedback you want to give me, I'd be glad to have it, but having a little more scope would be helpful.
Thanks for the feedback. Let's see. I think, yes. I get confused with the clerk, so yes.
Thank you. You know, as I look at this, and I appreciate the manager's and the staff's work, we've had quite an experience over the last few years of facing large shortfalls, looking at the painful cuts that are being considered, looking at other painful options. As I look at this, there's quite a bit less pain in this proposal. The Sheldon branch library isn't necessarily a cut, because specifically the manager is suggesting that we not cut it. He's suggesting that we use one-time monies for that particular one. So we're not cutting any libraries in his proposal. The Human Services is saying we think we can find a way to add that back as we go along. The other cuts aren't really cuts, and they're certainly not to high-value programs that everybody's always bringing out lots of citizens to give us input on. They're really more adjustments to how we deal with those things. So I appreciate that the manager and staff have listened well to the process of what we've gone through over the last several meetings. I think the 6 meetings we did were very valuable, because they informed, and the community got to weigh in, and it sounds like the staff listened well and the manager proposed well. I'm frankly almost ready to propose we accept this as is right now. I don't know why we wouldn't make such a motion. Interesting.
Eddie normally is the first one to say that, but
What I say is I don't like having so many meetings.
oh, got it.
Well, I wonder, let me ask hypothetically as a process question, if we made a motion to accept as proposed, we would still go through the public hearings on the issue, at least one, would we not?
Yeah, how we would do it, regardless if you just, whenever you do that. But our best outcome is over your next couple of meetings that you do land on a recommended budget. And then what we would do is we will take that, put it into all of the rest of the legal document, come back towards the end of April or early May, which then you would have to have a legally held public hearing on that, and then you would take action on that. And so the answer is yes, there is a legal requirement for a public hearing. The legal one wouldn't occur until
After it's formally written.
until the whole thing is put together. There's, as you know, there's still a lot of work that staff is doing on the whole budget. This is an extremely important part of that work. So if we land here, makes a huge difference as we're going forward. So,
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Will?
So I see a number of wins, and then I have a few concerns for this proposed budget strategy, and I do appreciate that staff and has definitely been listening to the committee and to the public. So some of the wins for me, minimal HSC cuts, potentially avoiding closing the branch libraries. From my brief reading of the packet, it looks like the sustainability manager's office remains open.
that's correct. In that bundle of services, human rights, neighborhoods, and sustainability, what you see today is what you would get, because there's already the vacancies that are there. So
as far as concerns, I have a couple here. You sent out an email to us about $500,000 difference that eWeb is going to change the amount of money that they give the city. Has that been voted on? Has that been approved yet?
Let me give just a quick snapshot, and then the answer is no. It's pending council and their board approval, but as I mentioned, both Roger and I believe it's a fair deal, and so that would be for us. And essentially what, from our perspective, we're trading off the volatility of a wholesale receipts, which are really one-time revenues that may or may not come in, for the certainty on the retail side, which we can budget against. And the way the math happens to work out through that is it's a $500,000 to the good for us. For them, it also has a number of advantages to that, with minimal, if any, impact on their retail rates or wholesale. I don't know their rate structure well enough. And so that's from our perspective, we're essentially converting the volatility of wholesale series of one-time payments, if they come in, into the assurity of an ongoing revenue source on the retail side. So and that happens to be a $500,000 bump for us.
Okay. Well, I hope that both sides want that to happen. It's concerned that eWeb is just willing to give us $500K.
But well, and I won't represent them. They're not just giving us $500,000. Roger would not enter into an agreement just to give away $500,000. So they receive important benefits for them. Part of which is how the wholesale market is managed by, and their ability to manage that differently than we can. And so there really are benefits to them, and they would have to explain those more clearly.
So other concerns, of course, using one-time fees for the library is concerning. I hope we can get a levy or some other revenue source passed. And the last thing on this list that concerns me is the parks maintenance. We just had 2 colossal snowstorms, and I know the park department has been working 12-hour shifts for quite a while to try to clear all the brush, and it just, looking at cutting 2 more positions to me is concerning in light of what has happened this past year.
It is absolutely concerning to us as well. And so when we think about stable versus sustainable budgets, over the last couple of years, really several years, there have been a number of presentations around sustainable operations, some of which have been in park maintenance. And I think what the council knows and we've learned is that it's not at a sustainable level. We're not providing the overall parks maintenance in total that we would like throughout the city. And so we will need to address that. I think what this is recognizing is there aren't great choices all the way down the line. And so we're trying to put together a budget that balances, that doesn't eliminate, doesn't devastate, doesn't create long-term issues that can't be overcome as we deal with the sustainability side of the budget. And so that's what you see on the park side as well as some of those others.
Thank you. I yield.
Bob.
Thank you. John, staff, well done. As we've gone through this process, I've learned one thing over the last year and a half. It's a lot easier to talk about a $2.5 million shortfall than a 5.3. It's nice to see the list is much smaller for what we now get to debate and pick over. I'm very happy to see that all the funds have stayed in the budget for public safety. I think that's very important. I know we will continue to hear from the supporters of the library. I believe in libraries, but I can just feel that's going to be a little bone of contention as to how we fund that and whether or not we use our revenue. It's nice to know that people are open to that potential option for a short-term fix for it. I am encouraged from what Marty said earlier with some of the directions that the revenue team's going. I think we might be able to come up with some options that can even help this budget and future years out more. It's nice to see that we are still placing value on city staff and services, and every cut's tough. Doesn't matter what department it is. There's going to be someone that's going to be unhappy about it. But I think the budget that you brought forth tonight in a great way mitigates some of that contention. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Brown.
Thanks. I've got a question about, it's a small amount, but and I realize it's probably not all articulated right now, but the $95,000 for central service travel and memberships. If we sometime before we end these budget talks, we could see a breakdown of that. I appreciate that. Yeah, there's lots of improvements here. I mean, it looks bright, much brighter. Still not really the way we would like to go, of course, but I still have some serious concerns personally about the transferring the stormwater services to the stormwater fund, and I'm not ready to articulate them right now. I've been thinking about it, and I want to present those concerns and questions in a more coherent manner. So hopefully I'll do that next week. Thanks.
Thank you. So Mayor Piercy, and then if there's no one else, we'll go to second round. Okay.
My comment's brief, and that is that my biggest, as you heard me say a few months back here, that my biggest concern was that we wouldn't decimate any portion of our services, and so I'm really pleased to see that we're not doing that, and that's very important. I would join others in being very supportive of trying to figure out a way to keep our branch libraries open, and I will be aligned on that. And then I want to say that I am continue to be a tad optimistic that the budget continues to at least look a little bit better and give us a little bit more relief, and that's good too. So I'm optimistic that we'll get to something that we can live with here.
Great. Thank you. Ken.
Councilor Brown reminded me that I had a question about the transferring stormwater services from general fund to stormwater fund. This has been out for a while and has been looked at, and I've gone through what you wrote up on it. When you talk about the longer term or indirect implications and what you wrote in there, you've got it said the fund, increasing expenses may result in marginal increase in the user fees, and that's been a topic out in the community. And can you talk, do you guys have any estimate at all about if you transfer $605,000 over there, how that, anything more solid than may?
A couple things, and then Kirk can weigh in if he feels like filling any gaps. Probably generally, the Stormwater Fund has had cycles through with its energy in the community around just the fund itself. From a core perspective, stormwater utility funds are extremely common across the country. They came into being probably 30 years ago, and it's a very practical, useful, appropriate way to maintain what is really a utility. What we've generally tried to do, like with all utility funds, is you want to try to keep pace with inflation, because there's operations and maintenance, but there's also capital projects. There's a lot of stuff that actually is underground or more so above ground, sort of green infrastructure to convey the stormwater. And so we will tend to do those annual CPI adjustments on the stormwater fund anyhow, and that's very appropriate. So when something like this were to transfer over into the fund, what that does is those costs do get accumulated into the total, and then as they go through their regular budgeting process to set the rate, they do have to account for all their costs. So does that mean at some point the rate would be adjusted because of that? Probably, because you have to account for the cost. Now, if there's something else that offsets it, not so much. But yeah, it has to be accounted for at some point in that, and it could have a marginal impact on the rates, yes.
So I guess the idea I've gotten, or the impression I've gotten over the months when this has been talked about, is that to the extent there's an impact, it's expected to be pretty minor.
Yes, that's true.
And I guess because of all of the different things going on and the complexity of it and the size of the fund, moving $600,000 in, it's kind of hard to say, yeah, it's going to.
So it will be marginal, but I don't want to leave the impression that it doesn't ever have to be accounted for, because it has to be accounted for as we've got to move forward. When, it just depends on the budget piece of that and how it ties into the CPI in costs, and then the specific amount, again, that just depends on what the total fund's doing, but it will be accounted for.
Okay.
Robert, Sarah, if you want.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Mark?
Thank you. I also commend you on great work, and I think this has been a different process and a good process. We've talked a bit about what we've heard from the public, and part of the message that I think was also represented by the public, not as, I think, loudly or as many times, was, at least in emails and comments I received, was that we're not doing enough. We're not cutting enough. We should make some of the harder choices. And I just want to represent that and recognize that I at least acknowledge that I heard that. I think there's a portion of the community that feels that way. Going back to a little bit of what we've heard is that, you know, some of the graphs and charts recognizing that pre-recession we were spending quite a bit more than we were taking in, nearly 3%. And even through the recession, we were spending more than we were taking in, 0.2%. And moving forward now, we're just projecting to spend just 0.3% less than we project to take in. I have some concern about whether, if that is truly enough, given the impact it would have that you've shown on how it would impact the revenue reserve for revenue shortfall, still driving that quite low, even though, as you pointed out, it doesn't take it to below zero, which is good. I've already heard 3 things from other members here that talk about things that they're going to want to figure out how to fund in addition to what you've presented, and El Rapa and the Human Services and Sheldon Branch, how those things will play in. So I can anticipate we're going to be talking about, as we have for years past, one-time funding, the phrase kicking the can down the road, and, you know, we're looking for more revenue, but that's not here today. So I just wanted to express those thoughts and my concerns around that, and again, hearing some of that messaging from the public. And it's not all about keeping services. Some people do feel that we should be cutting as well. So.
Great, thank you. Chelsea?
Thank
you. Hey!
Dave Weatherbill.
Done, you're on.
I also want to say that thanks to staff for all the work. I feel very encouraged by what's been presented today. I think that we're going to be able to come out of this with a good outcome based on all the work we've all done. I think it's going to be good. However, I do think I want to sleep on this, think things over, and I think that I really want to take a look at the values that we say we're going to be following and make sure we're funding things and according to that. And in particular, as I've been sitting here, making sure that the things we're funding ongoing match those values most, and maybe the things that we're funding one time are lower on the list, or just taking that into consideration, what we want to provide the most stability with, the most certainty with. One thing that I've recognized is that we're really looking at providing services in a different way. I've heard a few things that I just wanted to bring attention to. We've been talking about how to structure the library hours, essentially. Do we want to look at half days? To sit in order to basically trade to keep the branch libraries open? And I think that's a good thing to look at. I just want to make sure we're thinking about the implications. I think I've heard from Renee in the past that the downtown library gets thousands of visitors a day, where the branches get hundreds. And it's not to say that we should just think of it in terms of those numbers, but it's just something to keep in mind. And also to keep in mind that the downtown library has significant more amount of computer hours available for people to use for different things. I'm encouraged to hear the mention of using more social media in our communications, and I think that the more we can do to encourage our neighborhoods to use that mechanism in the future, we can look at their communications budget and basically reducing that by helping them communicate better through e-communication. A question I had, looking at the Human Services funding, the $25,000. So I think I heard that the marginal beginning working capital goes to the facilities fund. Mm-hmm. That's something else that's a little concerning, because if I'm not mistaken, the facilities fund has been something we've flagged as needing attention.
Would you like to be back in round 2 again?
Do you want me to respond to that, or do you wait?
You can go ahead and, if it's a question, go ahead and please respond now, yeah.
With respect to the marginal beginning working capital, yes, that's true. From a facilities perspective, that's another one of those stable versus sustainable conversations. And it has been a good policy to identify the first dollars, if there's any marginal beginning working capital towards that. In this case, what I think we've heard from the community, as well as this group, is that human services is a high value. I would agree with that. And if that's the case, then, as you suggested, we should probably budget it that way, which would mean we make it a priority over, in this case, facilities dollars. Not that they're not needed, we're creating the priority in that case.
I would completely agree with that. I just think we should recognize it's not free money, so to speak. There's a trade-off.
There's absolutely a trade-off, or could be a trade-off. There still may be additional dollars that we can put into the facilities fund. We just don't know that except year to year, but yes, you're right.
Okay, great. So we're heading into round two, unless there's anyone else who's not yet been heard. So, Councilor Polling, you're first. What's that?
It'll be 2 or 3 minutes.
Still 2 minutes at this point.
I may need a third round.
Okay.
First of all, John and Christy and all the staff that's worked on this, I too am very pleased with the work that's been done, particularly pleased with the fact that the police and fire EMS services have been able to remain intact. To me, that is the number one priority. The library thing is just kind of a button that got pushed, but I do appreciate all the hard work. I'd like to address some of the comments made as far as what Chris was saying about how and when to possibly close the library to make it a full day. And also, Chelsea, this is for you. I don't think that's for us to say when. I think that's something that staff has to figure out based on staffing levels and logistics and everything else. But if they can come up with a way to equal one full day, that'd be fine with me. And Betty, yes, you're right. The South Eugene doesn't have a branch library, but I'd just like to remind you and everybody else that the branch libraries were a result of multiple votes over many years by the citizens of this community to have those branch libraries and to staff them on a greater level than they are currently being staffed right now. They've taken a hit over the years. So that's why we have the branch libraries, because the people in our community voted for it more than one time. I'm a little concerned about going out for a levy. I'm a little concerned that if we just, and this is one of the discussions that we'll have to have, is if we just go out to fund the branch libraries, what kind of support are we going to get for that citywide versus bringing the entire library services back into an operating levy like we did before, and that would free up general fund money. And then the other $50,000 that we need to open the branch keep the Sheldon Branch Library open is add another $50,000 to the marginal beginning working capital for human services.
So, Michael, can we go ahead and give Councilor Polling another minute, and we'll go to 3 minutes at this point, because with the number of people we have in the queue, I think we can accomplish.
Actually, I think I got it.
You got it. Okay, still.
Unless another button gets pushed. Then.
Elegant and efficient.
We'll try not to push too many buttons.
What was that?
What I want to caution about is it isn't necessarily a one-for-one dollar between a branch and a downtown library. And so when we're thinking that, okay, if we close another half a day, that's what the Sheldon branch, there's fixed costs and variable costs in this equation. So keeping both branches open doesn't necessarily equate to just one day downtown. So I just want to caution that if we end up going sort of down that road, we will want to do our homework before people just make that assumption that it's a one-for-one trade. Because there are fixed costs that
how much we
is
need
different.
To do that.
Right. So.
Great, thank you.
So change it back to 2.
I think at this point we can accommodate 3 for this second round. So go ahead, Councilor Clark.
Thank you. I thought I'd bring this up as Revenue Committee folks are doing their work, and it's kind of a side question that just popped into my head. Seeing Bonnie here, I remembered the first question I asked at the first Budget Committee meeting I was in 10 years ago. And I felt kind of silly after I asked it because it was kind of a small little thing, but I wondered if we could look at investing in LED streetlights, because at the time, Kurt Corey had given us a presentation about the fact that in 2004, the city was spending over $1 million a year just for the electricity for streetlights. Today, I bet that number's bigger. I don't know that, but I bet it is. And I've read recently about some cities in the country who are now installing LED streetlights. And now that the time has come and maybe the technology's caught up, my question is, what would that cost the city from a capital perspective to install if we were going to bond it or look at some other way to do that? Because I think our community would support it. And even to expand the capacity for street lighting that was done that way, and at the same time saving on the power cost dramatically. So for the Revenue Committee, for staff, for whomever, I'd really be interested to know what would it cost to buy them and what would the savings be for operating them.
We'll provide some additional information on that whole topic.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Councilor Brown.
Thank you. I'd like to just go back to the Stormwater Fund briefly. It says transfer stormwater services to the Stormwater Fund. The way I remember it being presented in past budget committee meetings, I didn't bring any of the old materials, so my memory may not be accurate. But the way I remember it being presented was transferring park maintenance.
Right. That's how it is.
Because stormwater services are already covered by the Stormwater Fund. That's what it's there for. Okay.
Oh, so it should read that as park maintenance.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay. I think what I'll do is I'll read all the material again and then go through my thoughts and ask questions. I'll copy the whole committee rather than try to dig into it right now. I'm not quite prepared to do it right now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councilor Pryor.
Thanks. I'm actually glad that Councilor Brown brought that up because it was the topic I also wanted to work my recollection on. And I don't think it was ever the intent when I was asking about this stormwater fee transfer that it be approached consciously or even unconsciously as any kind of a bait and switch. That it's not the intent to transfer park maintenance into the stormwater fund to get it out of the general fund, and then at some point, conveniently in the future, to pump up the stormwater fees to recover all of that money again. I don't think that was our intention, and I recall last year when we were talking about the stormwater fee, this council explicitly said, that's not what we want to do. So my recollection and my intent, and I think that's what the intent is here, is to say if this maintenance gets transferred into the stormwater fund, it also represents a hit. It represents a hit to the stormwater fund, and that accommodations will have to be made within that. So it is I don't want to call it a cutting strategy, but it is a way to try to create a modification or an increased efficiency. There's a hit in that transfer, and there's a hit to that fund. So it's not just a way for us to figure out a way to jack up stormwater fees later on. That was not the intent, and I've not gotten the impression that has ever been the intent, was to use it as a bait and switch.
It's not intended as a bait and switch for sure. This gets back to Ken Beeson's comments that it would become part of the total stormwater package, and so it does have to be accounted for. What that looks like in the future, I don't know for sure, but the stormwater fund still needs to maintain itself. Could it have some marginal impact on rates in the future? Could. So I don't want to sell this as it has no impact whatsoever. I don't think that would be fair. The intent is not to just jack up all the stormwater rates. The conversation that was last year was, what if we transfer all the parks maintenance over to stormwater? Now that's a different conversation. But I don't want to leave people the idea that it won't have to be accounted for in the stormwater fund as we move into the future.
But there's no plan to say we're suddenly going to raise stormwater fees 200% at some short time in the future in order to pick up that slack.
No, what we will continue to do, there's cost of living CPI adjustments that we make every year, which we will continue to make as we move forward, for sure.
Thank you. Chelsea.
I think I just wanted to ask a question about the recreation services. You talked about the scholarship budget being reduced. I just want to make sure I understand what's going to happen there. So you said hopefully if there's leftover funds, I don't know if I understand.
Yeah, what the proposal is that we actually reduce that fund by 50,000.
50, and we'll have 52 left.
And it's about half of what's there currently now. There's 102,000 there. This would say let's reduce that by 50,000. And then what our intent would be is at the end of the year, in the recreation programs, as they kind of balance out their revenue versus expenses, sometimes there's additional dollars left at the end of that year. And so what we would want to do is then put that into essentially a scholarship sinking fund, which then would help try to replace some of that as we move forward. So there would still be the 52,000 that stays there and continues just like before. 50,000 would go away, and we'd hope to replace some or all of that as recreation fees come in through the year. That's what the intent would be.
If that happens now with this current fiscal year, if there's extra left over, where does that go to?
It gets dumped back into marginal beginning working capital. And we would also be trying to be aggressive with grants and things like that to kind of fill up that bucket at the same time.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments presently? No?
Look at that.
Okay. So, as Councillor Clark mentioned, I hope that we are feeling like we're a lot closer to something that we are going to be ready relatively to have some additional discussion and be relatively ready to actually put forward some motions and start to vote. I know that this is all new information, though, and people do need time to obviously go home and absorb it. My suggestion is actually that we use part of our meeting on the 5th for some additional public comment, because the public has not had a chance to provide any input on this. This is new information. So my suggestion would be that we use part of our meeting on the 5th for public comment and then continue our discussion and deliberation. We have meetings scheduled the 5th, the 6th, and the 11th. Depending on the public comment that we hear and the discussion and deliberation that we have, we may need all those meetings, or we may decide that we're close enough with some tweaks and some adjustments that we get there before that. So, John, did you have a comment?
I would just also encourage, if you have any questions, please feel free to call the exec that you work with on the budget side of things at any time. They can also answer questions, help track down information, any of that. So please use them as well throughout this process.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, is this available to the public either online or at the library or something?
To be posted online. Okay, good. That will be really helpful prior to the 5th. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Great. So if we're okay with that, then we're going to go ahead and schedule some public comment on the 5th, and then we'll continue with our deliberation then. So great opportunity to take this information home, dive into it, and call, email, ask any additional questions that you have. And we will thank you again very much to the staff for a lot of work. This is, I think, a great leap forward from where we were earlier. So thank you for that. And we will come back together again on the 5th. We're adjourned.
Good job.
There, thank you.
Right. Almost there.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Okay.